Carter's the author of 3 books. His first book on the Korean War, which I think was your DPhil dissertation. Another book entitled The Illusions of Victory. Yet another book, War Comes to Garmsir. And those of you who are familiar with the Vietnam War will remember War Comes to An Loc?
Long An.
Long An, okay. I should be more familiar, but
Long An lost the battle. So.
Right, yeah, exactly. That's a joke. Anyway, classic work of Afghanistan that Carter wrote, having served a prolonged period of time in Garmsir. The author, or the editor, co-editor, I should say, of Counterinsurgency
in Modern Warfare.
Counterinsurgency in Modern Warfare, and now the author of The American War in Afghanistan. So on that ground alone, you have the privilege of meeting an extraordinary scholar with a tremendous output, and every book is really, truly, brilliantly researched and argued. But Carter is the real deal. He has spent years on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. He works at the Center of Naval Analysis, CNA, where he's an analyst. Unlike many think tanks, CNA actually has its analysts in bed with and deploy with the forces that they're advising. So his advice and his experience isn't from the faculty lounges or the boardrooms of well-appointed think tanks on K Street, but rather is in the field. He deployed with the United States Marines at the invasion of Iraq in 2003, served in Anbar with the Marines. He was in Iraq until 2006. I've known Carter for almost 20 years. We sort of lost touch, and then I made a brief visit to Afghanistan in 2008, and we helicoptered into Asadabad in Kunar, which is about as out of the way as you can imagine. And when the helicopter touched down, Carter's walking towards me. So he was also with the provincial reconstruction team in Asadabad. Subsequently, as I said, spent an extended period of Garmsir. Subsequently was General Joseph Dunford's political military advisor when he was the ISAF commander. And then most recently was General Dunford's political military advisor when General Dunford was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So here you have someone that embodies totally the ethos of the security studies program, of theory and practice, and of scholarship and analysis. And there's really no one better to talk about Afghanistan than Carter, whose book couldn't be better timed. So we're especially fortunate to have him because he's quite busy these days. So thanks again, Carter.
Bruce, thank you for the wonderful introduction. Yeah, you are indeed too kind. But it's of course an honor to be here with the Security Studies program. And of course, I think you all know Professor Hoffman's contribution to security studies, from the study of Al Qaeda, the study of terrorism, the study of the Israeli War of Independence, and then continuing on with more work today. I think for those of us who started in this field, he is someone we look up to as an example. You know, someone who got a PhD, someone who moved on to working in the think tank world, and then moved into academia. Because many of us we want to move back into academia. We like the idea of teaching and writing. So thank you for the opportunity here and for the support over the years. How many of you have been to Afghanistan? All right. I figured there'd be a few. I know the security studies program here has some folks who are their former military or current military. So certainly not an easy time to watch Afghanistan anymore. Not that it ever was. And I think hard to understand exactly what's happened. Hard to understand perhaps why we were there, and maybe especially hard to understand why we stayed for so long. So today I was hoping to talk a little bit about why things turned out the way they did, which is really saying, why did we lose? Which for those of us who've been there is a very painful thing to say. I prefer to say, why did we not prevail? But if I was to look at it today based on, did we meet our objectives, did we not meet our objectives, and I was arguing with you, and you were saying we lost, I'd be hard pressed to win that argument. Because at this point, that's indeed what an objective assessment, I think, of the matter would suggest. So I'd like to talk a little bit about why we lost. In that, I'd like to be able to cover a few opportunities, a few things that maybe we could have done better, that would have led to a better solution. And I'd like to talk about why we didn't leave. Why did we stay so long? What kept us there for 20 years? And today that seems, I think it seems to everyone a little bit foolish that we stayed for so long. I'm not sure it was foolish as much as just the way it was going to be. As I talk, please feel free to ask questions. Please, if there's something you think needs further clarification, ask me. If you think that I'm wrong on something, please go ahead and point that out too. I'm sure that's beneficial for our discussion here and beneficial for those who are watching over the internet. And it is really great to be able to talk to a class full of people versus Zoom. No problems with Zoom, but it's great to be able to see people's eyes and see people face to face. So how did this turn out the way it has? I first went to Afghanistan in 2007, and I was very interested in why things were going so badly. Why were things not going well at that time? When we had started in 2001, we had quickly overthrown the Taliban government, and we had managed to, for years, there had been basic stability and security in much of the country. There had been some degree of peace with small amounts of violence. But then in 2005, and especially in 2006, things went bad. Violence emerged throughout the country. The Taliban launched offensives in the south. And the insurgency, the raging insurgency that we would face for the next years was really put in place. So I was very interested in how did all this come about? And I was thinking about that when I went to Garmsir. Garmsir is a district in southern Afghanistan. It's highlighted it a little bit on the map in the province of Helmand. It's an area that the Taliban came back to quickly in 2006, and it's an area that experienced a great deal of violence from 2006 onward, where the Taliban were strong. I went there in 2009, and I went there as a civilian with the State Department, and to be the political advisor on working with the government, and I would be attached to the Marine Battalion that was located there. And I'd stay for 2 years there. When I went there to Garmsir, I was trying to understand why things were violent there. Garmsir is in the middle of the desert. It's along the Helmand River, and it has anywhere between 2 to 10 kilometers of farmland on either side of the river. So it's this thin strip of green in the middle of the desert. Pashtuns, Afghans, live there. A variety of tribes live there. Some of them are elites who hold land and have held it for centuries. Others are poor, what we might call landless, who have to lease land or squat on land to be able to grow anything. When I got to Garmsir, I was very influenced by the writings of Sarah Chayes in her classic book, Punishment or Virtue. And if you're interested in Afghanistan, I really do suggest reading this book. She's a much better writer than I am, with much better stories. She spent 7 years in Afghanistan, in Kandahar, living there basically on her own, and learned to speak Pashto there. So extremely impressive. One of her foundational arguments is that the reason things went bad in Afghanistan were that the government and the warlords through which the government ruled and the United States mistreated people. And that caused people to want to turn back to the Taliban and help the Taliban. When I got to Garmsir, I saw plenty of evidence for this argument. I saw that those people who had been living on land that didn't have land of their own, I saw how the government or the tribes or the elite tribes would push them off that land. One of these was Mullah Naim Barich. Mullah Naim Barich was a Taliban commander in the 1990s from Garmsir, and he later was a Taliban commander after that. His family was landless. They didn't have a lot of land. They were religious leaders. And when the U.S. was able to return control of Afghanistan, or give control of Afghanistan to the government, the tribes of Garmsir, the government leaders of Garmsir didn't honor their land and harassed them in a variety of ways. You could also see how the police chief of the time would abuse people and treat them poorly, taking their money, putting people in jail unjustly. And then there was poppy eradication, which we sometimes assisted in which the poppies were eradicated largely of the people who were landless and didn't have a lot. So these people looked to the Taliban for help. They looked to the Taliban for help against the government. And they were willing to allow some of the Taliban to exist in their villages, give them support, give them money, the classic things that happen in an insurgency in terms of the people supporting the insurgents. But this explanation also wasn't all that I saw in Garmsir. Because in 2006, there wasn't a massive revolution inside of Garmsir where the people revolted against the government or the tribes there. Rather, it was 500 Taliban coming from Pakistan and taking over the district. They received the help of people in the district. And many of those people coming from Pakistan were not Pakistanis or Afghan refugees living in Pakistan, but they came from outside. And so this suggested another problem that exists in Afghanistan, another reason for the violence we've seen. The refuge that the Taliban have been able to have, were able to enjoy in Pakistan, where from 2001 onward, their leaders were able to have refuge. They were able to reorganize, get training from sometimes groups like Al-Qaeda, sometimes parts of the ISI, or sometimes themselves to restart an offensive in Afghanistan. President Musharraf at the time has admitted that around 2003 to 2004, he gave permission for the Pakistani intelligence to ISI to again go ahead and help the Taliban. And without those refuges, it would have been harder for the Taliban to have organized. Some of their key leaders certainly would have been detained. And they wouldn't have been able to figure out how to do things like IEDs and suicide car bomb attacks. But that Pakistan problem is also just one problem here. Because war, as you probably know, is a contest between two sides. And it's a contest between two sides to see which one will come out on top, often on the battlefield. So when those 500 Taliban arrived from Pakistan, that doesn't necessarily mean that they should have taken everything over, because in a normal situation, you'd say that there'd be a battle to be fought, and one side would win and the other side might lose. Well, in this case, when the Taliban arrived, there were barely any Afghan forces there to oppose them. There were no army forces at all, and there were about 15 police. So that would fall on the question of why weren't more police or more army built up earlier in the conflict to provide something to oppose the Taliban. Now, that's not all, because there are those tribes I mentioned before. And there's the tribes and the government. One can also ask, well, why did the tribes of the government rally their own people to oppose the Taliban? And in fact, in 2002 to 2004, there were about 700 tribal militia in Garmsir defending the district. But what happened here was that the different tribes and even elements of the government competed with each other, conflicted with each other, could not get along, did not have unity. So in the course of those early years, in the course of this competition, various militias and groups went to ground, stopped working with the government, and the different leaders that were there disagreed and argued with each other. So when the Taliban arrived, the Taliban didn't have much to oppose them. Now we juxtapose this against the Taliban. The Taliban themselves were fairly cohesive. And I don't mean cohesive like the United States military, but I mean cohesive in the sense that they were less likely to argue with each other, less likely to fight with each other, more likely to obey various leaders in getting the job done. So this gives them an advantage. And if you want to understand why are the Taliban like this and the other Afghans aren't like this, well, part of it gets to the Taliban ethos and kind of their moral code. And under Islam, there's great emphasis on obedience, and the Taliban are largely led by religious leaders. The name of the Taliban is, of course, the word for students, religious students. So much of the Taliban organization are actually religious students and religious leaders. And there's a sense of hierarchy that exists there. You can read about the hierarchy when you read books such as My Life as a Taliban by Mullah Zaif, who was a Taliban leader. And I've heard it from Taliban at Doha, such as Amir Khan Motaki, who is currently their foreign minister, who talked about how important obedience is to the Taliban and staying united. So this is also something one can readily read about if you're reading the books of like David Edwards or Olivier Waugh, who talks about this kind of difference that the Taliban have. So I leave Garmsir in 2011. And I returned to Afghanistan in 2013. And I'm going to be the advisor to General Dunford, who is the commander of all US forces and NATO forces and allied forces inside of Afghanistan. And my job there is to be his advisor. Now, from Kabul, I can view Afghanistan from a much wider view. And I can go to a lot of different places and see a lot of different things that are going on. And so I really enjoyed that opportunity. It was a fantastic opportunity. Now, what I saw during that time there, though, was some places, what I saw happen in Garmsir also happened in those other places. So there was some degree of greater validity to what I had seen in this one small case. But I also saw that some other things were happening. For one thing, in many places, the Afghan army and police were having trouble fighting on their own. Not everywhere, but in many places. And it was hard to fit those other explanations that I had just mentioned into what was happening. I really had to force the explanation. And probably in your methodology courses you've now learned, you don't really want to force an explanation. You don't want to force the evidence to fit what you're seeing happen, or what to fit a theory. So I was trying to figure out more, why are we continuing to see this problem with the Afghan forces, the police and army that we've now trained heavily? Why are they still having trouble? Well, one of the reasons that's come out very clearly, and you've now read a lot about in the news, is corruption. So the Afghan forces would often not have the amount of supplies they were supposed to have, not have the weapons or the ammunition that they were supposed to have. Why? Because perhaps their commander would sell it for money. Perhaps a general above the commander would decide, I don't want to give these weapons down here. I'm going to hoard it for myself over here. Sometimes units in the field wouldn't have they wouldn't have the number of forces they were supposed to have, because there's this phenomenon of ghost soldiers, where a commander somewhere up the level has a roster that has everyone's name in it that's supposed to be in the unit, but in reality on the ground, all those people aren't there, because some of those names are ghosts. The commander's collecting money for those names, but the names aren't actually in the field. So that's a problem for having enough manpower. There's also the issue that commanders, and I've had so many Afghans tell me this, that they will have to pay, they have to pay to Kabul or pay upwards to be allowed to have the command position that they're at. And so that, of course, means that having paid a lot of money, that they now want to tax the people, tax the locals, do something to get that money back, and probably keep up paying up the chain, which is required. So this corruption problem exists, but corruption also can't explain everything, because what we were seeing in 2013 and 2014 wasn't oftentimes when an Afghan force would be defeated, it would actually outnumber the Taliban that were attacking it. They would have still weapons. They would still have vehicles. They'd still have ammunition, and more than the Taliban would have. This should be evident to us as we look at the newspapers lately, and you see how many arms and such that the Taliban have captured. But the best example is the Battle of Kunduz in 2015, where the Afghan forces there, about 5,000, they were estimated attacked by 2,000 or fewer Taliban. Some estimates are just 500. And they largely ran, surrendered their equipment, and didn't fight. So that means the corruption problem wasn't the only thing that was happening here. But maybe corruption can still be looked at from a different angle. And that's the question of, did the soldiers fighting on the ground feel that their leaders were going to take care of them, going to help them, or did they feel that they were going to put money into their pockets and not assist them? So there is some evidence that this is what's happened, and I've encountered a decent amount of it myself. I remember a very close friend who was fighting in Lashkar in 2016 telling me that it's just the leadership. We can't count on our leadership. We're out here on our own. If you read, there was an article by Sami Sadat, who was a corps commander in Helmand, who mentioned the same thing. That article came out about a month ago. He mentioned many problems. That was one problem that he mentioned. There was an article just this weekend in the Washington Post that quotes an Afghan soldier, I think, not a policeman, saying the same thing. But this argument, too, has some weaknesses. So I'd say that one weakness is that, well, actually, I know a lot of commanders, Afghan commanders, who went to great lengths to take care of their men, who remember well the consul of Ahmad Shah Durrani, the founder of the Afghan state, that a good king must take care of his soldiers. Like Abdul Razak, who did a variety of things that were incredibly unsavory and wrong, but still was known to whip out money when he was seeing his troops and hand $20, $50, $100 to each soldier, who was known to want to make sure that his soldiers always had enough weapons and good boots. or to my friend Omar John from Helmand, who made sure that he had a strong stock of weapons, that it was well taken care of, and that his posts and forces at front line were doing everything they needed to do. Another way to look at this question, though, is also exactly how good do we think the Taliban were? So if we think the government leadership was bad, we should also remember that the Taliban were usually fighting for just about no pay. They were usually drastically undersupplied, drastically under-equipped. Usually their commanders were off in Pakistan, especially the higher level leaders, or sitting in Doha. And also that the Taliban fighters, if they got wounded, they had nowhere to go but Pakistan, usually across the desert or the mountains with very poor chance of surviving. So when you put that into the equation, I think one has to wonder, okay, wasn't something else deeper also happening? And that leads me to the point, one of the main points of the book, which is that the Taliban had an edge in inspiration. The Taliban were able to inspire people to fight because they were fighting against occupation. And they were an Islamic force fighting against occupation. Occupation by a group that were by us, and we are generally not Islamic. And the idea of fighting against occupation is something that's very deep in Afghan history. It goes before actually the British invasions of the 19th century, back to fighting the Mughals, back to fighting the Persians. So that sense of resisting occupation goes very deep. I don't think that's hard to understand. I think that exists in many countries and in many cultures. But it was there in Afghanistan. So but on the other hand, the government forces, they have to fight alongside of us, have to fight alongside a government that is easily labeled as a puppet. And that saps and wears down at their morale. Think about a young Afghan soldier. A young Afghan soldier will go up in a village. He'll go to the mosque several times a week. And the mullah will speak about Afghanistan's history and duties and obligations under Islam. A decent amount of those mullahs won't say that jihad was correct. They'll live in a culture where the fighting against the Soviets is revered, and those people are heroes. Then that soldier will have to be careful in his own village because people will be wondering who he's working for and what his allegiances are. So how inspired is that soldier going to be to go to the last measure? Versus how inspired are the Taliban going to be to go to the last measure? And I think it helps explain the difference that we've seen here. Now, the evidence for this argument can be found, clearly in what the Taliban say. The Taliban say it readily. And multiple Taliban commanders and such have mentioned it to me time and time again. It's president's surveys of Taliban, and a variety of surveys have been taken. We've sometimes disregarded that as Taliban propaganda, but I think the depths of it suggest that there's actually some degree of truth in it. And many of the surveyors have now come to say that, no, there's something that exists here. You can see it if you take time to look at various battles that have been fought and look at statements that the Afghan soldiers have made versus statements the Taliban have made. Now, it takes a good deal of research to find that. But in 5 or 6 battles, I can show that those kind of differences in sentiment exist. And you can see it by what the government themselves say. The government forces themselves will bring this up. And that's perhaps most famously brought about in what President Karzai said to General Eikenberry when he was there and to General McChrystal when he was in Afghanistan. And I'm probably going to mess this quote up, but it goes on something like this. General, if there is an insurgency in Afghanistan, it means some people are challenging the legitimacy of my rule. And since you are here inside of our country, they could legitimately say that I am a puppet. And since Afghanistan is a pious Islamic country, they could legitimately call for jihad against both you and me. So you can see, General, there can be no insurgency in Afghanistan. And in saying what cannot be, he was demonstrating his understanding of probably what was. So when I make this argument, I should also clarify somewhat that I am definitely not saying that Islam is somehow violent or war prone. That's not the point here. The point is, if there is an occupier that's of a different religion to the country, then it can be a motivating and inspirational force for people to fight. So I'm also not trying to say here that this is the sole explanation of what we've seen in Afghanistan. I tried to take the time to go through all these different explanations to show that it's actually very layered. There's actually a variety of conditions that are happening. And many of those conditions are necessary. Some of them may not be, but I don't think any one of them is sufficient. No one of these conditions explains everything that's happened in Afghanistan and can explain exactly why it is that the government forces were not able to succeed, why they weren't able to persevere on their own, which then, of course, means why our efforts were unable to succeed. And so I'd like to shift now to kind of the last part of the talk here, which is that if it was so difficult to succeed, if there were so many conditions in place that were going to make it hard to win, why didn't we leave at some point? Why didn't we stay? Why did we stay for so long? And so really, I'd argue the thing we just need to keep intense attention to on this is the context of the international system at the time and the context of domestic politics at the time, which the first thing that matters here is the terrorist threat to the United States. For those of you who remember this in 9/11, you probably remember viscerally how there was a sense of threat, how there was a sense that America was being threatened by something that had never been threatened before. So, I mean, the idea of terrorists blowing up buildings, some of you may remember this, that wasn't really terribly, in the 90s, that was more the stuff of action movies or science fiction movies. It was dealt with as something that was possible, but really something that was fantastic. But what 9/11 showed is not only would they be willing to attack buildings, but that if they're willing to attack buildings, they'd be willing to use biological weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons. And some of that may seem far-fetched again now, but at the time it was a very real fear. 50 to 85% of Americans were worried about another terrorist attack in the years following 2001. President Bush and his team was extremely worried another attack was likely and was going to occur. They were hearing daily about different plots and such that were happening, and they were having trouble sifting through what was true and was not true. There was an anthrax scare in the Capitol. A few days after the 9/11 bombings, you may forget, another plane randomly lands in the middle of Brooklyn. So there's a sense something's going to happen, and we need to act. But there's a domestic political part of this too. What kind of punishment are the voters going to levy upon whatever president lets another terrorist attack happen? Whatever president isn't standing up and making sure that something was going to occur. So this means that even after we've toppled the Taliban and dealt a fairly heavy blow to Al-Qaeda, that leaving Afghanistan is not something that is readily considered. It's not something President Bush and his team considers. They look at having left Afghanistan in the 90s as having created a vacuum, allowing this terrorist threat to grow. And it's something that they should not do again. That sense lasts throughout their presidency. When President Obama comes in, that threat of terrorism still hasn't entirely left. There had been Al-Qaeda attacks since 2001, and Osama bin Laden was still at large. So President Obama has to decide whether or not to send more troops to Afghanistan to try to right the situation there and try to prevent it from becoming a terrorist safe haven again. He, at no time in that discussion, was there any consideration of leaving Afghanistan. There was a great debate on whether to reinforce Afghanistan, but not whether to leave Afghanistan. And in fact, in the documentary record, which on this particular subject is actually pretty large, in no place does any member of the cabinet or anyone in the military say we should leave Afghanistan. And President Obama several times says outright, this is off the table. We are staying in Afghanistan. It's possibly true that some conversations happened offline or happened at some dinner or some random event here or there, but there's nothing officially that's there in that regard. It's not until Osama was killed and the surge is proven to be incredibly costly as the Obama administration turned towards leaving Afghanistan. Even then, that process is taken very carefully. And it's not until May of 2014 that they make the decision to leave, setting a departure date at the end of 2016. That never happens. Why doesn't that happen? That doesn't happen partly because the Islamic State emerges, becoming a threat in Syria, in Iraq, arriving in Afghanistan. And then also the Islamic State conducts attacks in Europe, conducts attacks in the United States, which then that raises again this problem of terrorist attacks and the domestic backlash for doing so. Also put that upon the domestic context in the United States at that time of 2016. A context of concerns on the xenophobia could be risen if there's attacks in the United States, of concerns that certain politicians might fan the flames of that. So that all raised the impetus for staying in Afghanistan and not leaving. And at the same time, the Taliban were making gains in it. So President Obama, very torn about it, decides to stay. President Trump wanted to get out more than any other US president. He was disgusted with Afghanistan. And had some very combative meetings with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the military, very early in his tenure. But he repeatedly decides to stay in Afghanistan. First, with his 2017 South Asia strategy that actually increased some of the number of troops in Afghanistan. Later on, he insists again that we should leave, and we commence negotiations. But at various times in that discussion, he also repeatedly states that I need to keep a counterterrorism presence, I need to keep an intelligence presence. And at one point, when the Taliban kills some Americans, he drops the negotiations entirely and suspends negotiations, and negotiations don't go anywhere for 6 months after that. At the end of his term, after he's lost, there's a moment when it appears that he wants all US forces to leave. But he's dissuaded from that. And what dissuades him? We don't know for sure, but the available evidence suggests that his cabinet members and the military laid out to him just how awful the situation in Afghanistan could be, just how awful the collapse could look, and that deterred him from doing so. And he left 2,500. Now, President Biden, of course, has decided to leave Afghanistan. But as a historian, I tend to look at the structure as much as the individual. And there's no doubt that I tend to look at the context as much as the individual. And there's no doubt the context has changed now. The terrorist threat has dramatically decreased. Osama bin Laden is gone. The Islamic State has really been punched hard. And so that sense of threat is less. Even if perhaps, I think Bruce and I will probably discuss, Professor Hoffman will probably discuss a little bit coming about how much the threat really exists or not. But certainly the sense of a threat has diminished. We have different concerns in the United States about our economy, about our domestic political stability, and different wider concerns about climate change and Russia and China, great power competition. And then the other thing I think is we have to mention here is COVID. I think COVID changes a bit of the perspective about how much we should be worried about terrorist attacks. More people were dying per day at the height of COVID than they were perished tragically on 9/11. So the context has changed. The era of concern about terrorism may have passed, and that encouraged us to get out at the time we've gotten out. So to conclude, or I guess two important points to conclude on. One is that I think the idea that a US president easily could have gotten out is probably unhelpful. It's probably more helpful to look at the history and look at the difficulty of how difficult it was to leave and to kind of see under Afghanistan in that light. I mean, to a certain extent, the last 2 months perhaps have made it clearer to understand why we didn't leave, because no American president wanted to see what happened in the last 2 months. No American president wants to deal with that whether morally or domestic politically, or in terms of a threat to the United States. And that probably explains it better than most other things. But then the second point here is, if you think about Afghanistan, what does this mean for Afghanistan? It means it's a situation where it was very hard for us to win and very hard for us to get out. A situation that is less like a choice than a trial we had to go through. It is certainly tragic, but it's also, I think, important for us to understand the history that's there and understand that some things just aren't easily avoided. Some things the country just ends up going through. But I think that perspective is probably more helpful than the perspective of we could have won if we had done this, or we could have left if we had just done this. So I will conclude with that, having failed throughout that to stop to let you guys ask any questions. So I'm sorry about that.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And there's no one better to dissect the past 20 years as you have. Well, it's interesting because I'll just say parenthetically, this morning, Jacob Ware, a former SSP graduate, myself, have an essay in Small Wars Journal, which takes on a lot of these issues. So actually, let me make some counterpoints. Right. And I'd be really curious for your response. Then we can open up for questions. And these would have been a lot of my questions anyway. Well, the first one that I want to ask, which isn't a counterpoint as much as a question, and this is based on, especially your counterinsurgency and modern warfare volume, which is invaluable. Why is it? I mean, the lessons that you're talking about, we started calling them in Iraq population-centric as opposed to enemy-centric warfare, and supposedly we got it right. So even when we're learning the lessons, why were we so pathetically abject in achieving them, right? And shaping the battlefield environment in a different way in Afghanistan that would have countered the abuses that you're talking about, because clearly we knew about them. And if you read the Cigar report and now the Pentagon papers, they're pretty clear. So that would be my big question. And students of mine will know this is something that I've taught for a quarter of a century now, which is that, why is it too? I mean, I have my own theory, but I'd be curious, why is it too that insurgents and terrorists and guerrillas learn all these lessons much better than governments and militaries do? So as much as I've opposed leaving Afghanistan, there is something to be said, especially from this very eloquent disposition, that if we're not going to get it, maybe we should stop pretending we're a great power too. But that's another story. I guess what I would respond to from a terrorism specialist or point of view to your comments is that, yes, and this is the reasons for leaving and the presidents. And, all of that is true. But I think, firstly, as General Mattis famously said when he was CENTCOM commander in 2013, the enemy always gets a vote. And it's not over until the enemy basically says it's over. And having studied terrorism for nearly 50 years now, astonishingly, the problem is we're talking about a completely nonlinear phenomenon that is very idiosyncratic, depending situationally and conditions based. So even if there is this quiescence now, and history tells us it's going to be short-lived, because otherwise terrorism would have stopped being a national security nuisance 2,000 years ago. So that concerns me. And for me, yes, everything you've said about Afghanistan is right. But of course, when Osama bin Laden was killed, we had 110,000 troops there. 5 years later, we had literally a fraction of that. We had 10,000 and then it drew down. So why was the modest number of troops of the past 6 years a luxury that a great power could afford? And honestly, I mean, do we really need those troops? Are they going to confront China and Russia? I mean, that seems like a very modest number of the combat potential of the military. I would also say that the biggest risk wasn't so much that the Taliban would take over, although I think for the Afghan people, it's an enormous risk, because I think morally, we still owed them a lot. I mean, we reformed and rebuilt that country. We encouraged women to become more involved. We empowered them, and now we've just turned our back. And as you well know, as many people in this room know, the Afghan people are suffering terribly now, or at least those who are allied with the United States. But I guess, my concern is that this is just even if the analysis of many people is that the terrorism threat has receded, this has just given an immense boost, which also, as we know from terrorism, isn't going to manifest itself probably within the lifespan of even the Biden administration, or maybe the tail end of it. But that this is something that we're going to confront as we did in the 1990s, a terrorist threat that diminished. For me, it's like deja vu all over again, because in the 1990s, we were told the Taliban wasn't a threat and that Al-Qaeda would be in its box there and really may intend to do all these bad things around the world, but has absolutely no capability of doing so. And I think we're repeating that. And then the last point, because I want to hear from you. What's always concerned, well, and let me compliment you about something. In the president's litany of blaming everyone and everything for the poor situation he was in, it's remarkable. Not once did he mention Pakistan and the cross-border support and sanctuary. And we know anybody who's taken the insurgency classes at SSB knows. I mean, David Galula, in the context of Algeria, argued that if you're up against an adversary that has access to sanctuary and safe haven, you're fighting almost a losing battle. So to me, that's like the red light flashing. But the one thing that concerns me, and I really will stop here, is that we often also no longer talk about WMD. There was a time in the 1990s that was the hottest topic imaginable, terrorism and counterterrorism. Iraq obviously put a huge wet blanket on that. But from my work in the US government and the intelligence community, if you look at George Kennett's In the Center of the Storm and various other accounts, I mean, Al-Qaeda was at, infantile stage, which it had non-existent nuclear capability, but it was dead serious about acquiring a nuclear weapon. We know also, at least I firmly believe, that they were simultaneously developing chemical, biological, and radiological as well, and probably were 2 years from weaponizing anthrax, which is quite extraordinary. So, I mean, these are the kinds of threats too, that's the problem with counterterrorism, the dog that doesn't bark, maybe the most important dog, but unfortunately, terrorism always becomes, and I know the military is particularly enthusiastic about this, a lower priority contingency because it's so difficult to fight. It's not amenable either to the American way of war, which I think is a big issue in this, or for the types of metrics and, immediacy of threats that we tend to want to build against.
Thank you. So I'll probably take these in reverse order. First of all, I'd say that I don't know that the era of terrorism has truly passed. I think that the sense it's passed is why we get is a reason why we get the decisions today. But we don't know that until time goes on. And so then I'll follow that with a story, which I don't think you've heard this story. You've heard other stories about me talking to the Taliban about Al-Qaeda, but this one's a little different. I was General Dunford's representative on the Doha negotiations in 2019. And you have the big senior leaders that were there, and then you have some of the others who are working things in the background. So often they're the children of the big senior leaders. So one of these comes up to me one day, and a lot of the negotiations have happened. We're very far down the road. And he says, so I was wondering, if we go forward this agreement, what happens to someone who was Al-Qaeda but isn't Al-Qaeda anymore? Can they live in Afghanistan? Do they need to go to jail? Could they be punished? And I said, that's really a question you need to bring up to the whole U.S. delegation, because that could be very, very problematic. So you need to. I can't answer that question for you. You need to take that up. And I, of course, reported duly what I just heard. He then says, well, what if it's a group of people who were Al-Qaeda and they want to live here? I said again, you should talk to people about that. And then he says, well, what if it's other Arabs and other people whose countries don't want them, but they want to live in Afghanistan? Because we always try to be guests, and we try to be hosts and have guests come. Can they come here? And I gave the same answer. He says, well, what if there are Taliban who worked with Al-Qaeda? Does anything have to happen to them? And then what if there's Taliban senior leaders who work with Al-Qaeda? Does anything, can they live and have any problems? And I, of course, give the same answer to all of this. So it's a very suspicious list of questions, which I think that goes to your point that look, Al-Qaeda isn't dead. Al-Qaeda is still there. And moreover, other terrorist groups may emerge there. And I actually think that they are likely to emerge. What I don't know is what degree of threat they're going to pose soon. And if they do pose one, what the magnitude of that threat is going to be. So then you asked about the choice of staying or leaving. Should we have stayed or should we have left? My opinion on that at the time, my opinion today was that both of those were viable choices. To stay or leave were both viable choices. To me, it wasn't clear. I agree when people say it was a hard choice for President Biden to make. So with 2,500 troops, like you said, it's not very expensive to keep 2,500 troops there. It's a small number of troops. 2,500 troops probably would have prevented the country from falling. Good chance it would have prevented any of the major cities from falling. We've been very effective in our airstrikes and the conduct of those forces for half a decade at that point. With a small number of troops, just like Professor Hoffman mentioned, we had kept the Taliban at bay. The Taliban were gaining ground, but we had held things we had held things back, and there's no reason to think that wouldn't have continued to happen for a great deal of time longer. Now, it was better when we didn't have 2,500 there, but when we had 8,600 or 10,000, because it's just easier to do all those things I just mentioned with that larger number of troops. When President Trump went down to 2,500, he made things a lot thinner, and he made the argument between staying and leaving. It made the choice between staying and leaving a lot more difficult to make by taking those actions. I think leaving is also a viable choice, but we have to be ready to bear the risks that Professor Hoffman just mentioned. We have to understand that when we're not there, that these things will regrow. There will be a threat here, but we have to opt for our own defenses, something that's over the horizon, but probably more important than any of that is just resilience. So I see both of these as viable choices to have been made. So I think that's my answer to that part. And then, so you also asked, why didn't we react quicker? Why didn't we do better? I think my answer I'd say that by part of that is we didn't understand Afghanistan for too long. We ignored it for too long. We were overconfident, especially we were overconfident for too long. And I'd say this is a problem that I can trace to multiple times in the history of the war in Afghanistan. That our leaders will often look at what's happening and think that the things are going to go in one direction. But as a historian, as an analyst, as an intel analyst, whatever it is, you kind of know that, well, I can't tell you that history is going to go in one direction. I can tell you, okay, I think it's more likely to go here, but it could still go here. And here's these other ways that things could go. The responsibility of the decision maker is to weigh those, but not to go in one direction, not to go one way and think this is definitely what's going to happen. But we did that with our overconfidence earlier on, and we can mention some other times since then where we also tended to think things were going to go in one direction, instead of thinking, well, the Taliban may come back. What are some easy, cheap things we could do to prevent that from happening? Well, we might want to bring them into the political process. We might want to build an army. We might want to train that army fairly well. These aren't very costly to do. We might want to think about changing some of our own tactics and adapting some of the things that we were doing to deal with this insurgency. So I think that's really important as to why we missed it. In terms of the other thing I think I'd say there also though is that that book, Counterinsurgency in Modern Warfare, at this point I feel like at some point we should rewrite part of it, because I feel like we've now had this tremendous period of learning for 20 years. So many of the things from the earlier 40, 50 years remain true, but I think there's more to be said now, especially about that being in these conflicts and it demands you have to be there for a long time. Mm-hmm. If you be there for a long time, you don't want to have a lot of forces there because that's expensive. And then if you still don't like it, being there for a long time, well, then you shouldn't get in. That these become some fundamental strategic questions that don't really exist in the in the literature beforehand. So I think how we could fight light with a small footprint for a long period of time, I don't think we really had that figured out until 2012 maybe, and it wasn't really implemented and done effectively until 2017. So maybe you'd say we didn't really have it figured out until 2017.
You know, the one thing too, and then we'll open up for questions, is that which you did bring up, but I think is absolutely key, is we spent a lot of time the past few weeks blaming the Afghans without looking in the mirror. And obviously, I would say the two original sins that doomed us there, which you didn't address directly, but one you point out. First, it was a failure to kill Osama bin Laden at Tora Bora, December 2001. So we can never get it right. We either too few troops or too many. We had occupy and invade and occupy countries with hundreds of thousands, or a very modest infusion of troops could have changed history. But then, having made that mistake, clearly you're wrong.
Yeah,
And this, you know, we look hard in the mirror. As difficult as Afghanistan was, I mean, you mentioned this, is we distracted. We took our eye off of it, and everyone knows for a fact that just voluminous resources, intelligence, men, and material that were deflected to Iraq for a long period, as precisely during the period you're discussing when the Taliban came back, and when some of those remedial measures would have been really smart, because it would not have necessitated then pivoting and having belatedly under the Obama administration with the surge decide to recommit. It's just a lamentable story.
Yeah.
You know, it really is. And for someone who was in university when South Vietnam fell, it's
too cyclical.
And as a student, well, it's just, it's enormously depressing. I thought that was the end of it. In fact, Brian Jenkins has said to me, he said, you know, Brian Jenkins, of course, very famous terrorism expert, who was a Green Beret in Vietnam, and then subsequently was was a senior advisor there. He said, I've now lived through 2 evacuations. Neither of them were pretty. He said, and they only got worse. So that was a telling statement. But anyway, we've spoken enough. I'm sure all of you have lots of questions. So
yeah, I have 2 questions. So first, with respect to the over the horizon capability, this could go to both of you. You know, how effective do you really think this is going to be in conducting counterterrorism operations? Because I was an Army Ranger, I'm very familiar with the targeting cycle. And I know that, you know, SIG and IMINT aren't going to be enough for us to drive that targeting cycle. Not only that, but for us to conduct raids within Afghanistan, we're putting U.S. forces at pretty significant risk if they can even conduct those operations now. And when we conduct those raids, you know, the documents, the cell phones, the computers are really what drive that. The second question I had, I know you were in Doha as a part of the negotiations, but what was the perception then? I mean, did we really, I guess my concern is, I mean, I know some of the negotiators or some of the people that were on the team, and I don't think that they ever fully understood that really this agreement was just going to be a political fig leaf, and we weren't going to adhere or enforce or use any of the enforcing mechanisms against the Taliban. So I was wondering if you could provide some insight into that. Like, how did we let it get to this, essentially?
On over the horizon, so I think the easiest way to mention is, like, just look at a map and look at the distance, right? That tells you about everything you need to know. And then think about the strike that happened, the last strike that we conducted, which I'm definitely not going to criticize anyone there, but it just shows how targeting in an urban area is difficult, is hard. And so those things together, I think, give one enough of an understanding that over the horizon is not easy. And that's why I've leaned back in my comments to leaving Afghanistan in one way or another means we need to be resilient if we're not going to go back in at some point. So do you want to say anything over the horizon before I turn to the negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, I can be very brief. It's not going to work. As you know, it's not.
Yeah.
There's no way. This was the same argument. I mean, that's what frustrates me so much. We heard all the same arguments in the 1990s about Taliban and the threat from there. One thing I do want to say, to add to it, I know, and I am definitely a minority voice, but this resilience stuff is complete bullshit.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. This country is not resilient, and we can see why it's not. We can't even agree on this terrible disease. But I say this from the time I spent, this is when you get old. You spend time everywhere and you sort of then mine your own experience, which I think are valid, but that's what everybody thinks too. But in Israel in 2002 and 2003, and you can go and look at an article, The Logic of Suicide Terrorism in the Atlantic in June 2003, which was based on that. Israel is a resilient society. I mean, most people serve in the military. They're in a constant state of war. They're surrounded by terrorist threats. And that's what always stunned me. They were brought to their knees by suicide bombing. I mean, I saw it every day, and that society completely cracked. Again, being as old as I am, a few people in this room will remember the snipers.
I remember the snipers.
Yeah, okay, this psychopath and his teenage sidekick were almost paralyzing DC. People were afraid to go to gas stations and to strip malls. So I think many people say this with terrorism. It was cracking in Israel. We can keep saying it. And again, this isn't disrespectful to you, but it's not going to work here. And that's the problem from my perspective, why we're so vulnerable now, because we always forget that terrorism is a strategy of provocation and they're trying to provoke some response. And they hope, just like in 9/11, a way over the top response that also then justifies us invading multiple countries, that feeds into their narrative, that undermines confidence in elected leadership, that divides polities. This is the stock and trade of terrorists for centuries. And we never realized that. And so for me, the next attack, I don't think that's the problem. The president, having now surrendered this forward ability, will have to respond with any credibility. Well, this particular president in particular, but I think ones that follow, very harshly. And that always worries me. And I remember right after 9/11, some of the discussions of how he would respond were, absolutely horrifying. I mean, there were in discussions with, as they say, adults, people saying we were going to turn Afghanistan into a parking lot. Fortunately, common sense prevailed, but it wasn't the Afghan people who were our enemy. But this is what worries me, is that our response to terrorism, and I see no reason to believe that that's ever going to change, is like always way over the top. And that's why I would have argued, especially in Afghanistan, but if my children don't listen to me, I'm not going to expect policymakers to. I hope my students do at least. A more stable approach to counterterrorism that's consistent and modest would be much better than our zigging and zagging, which we're always doing.
Yeah, so what I take from that is I need to not forget my Pashto. And maybe I need to expand into Arabic a little bit because the word it's going to keep on coming, and I'm not going to be able to escape from this anytime soon.
Well, and don't forget President Biden, when he met with the Iraqi prime minister in July, said we're leaving Iraq by the end of the year too. So, and very similar arguments too. It's basically the force protection issue against the Shia militias. Right. But anyway, there's a second part of the question.
So the perception of negotiations, how did it go? How did it go awry? I want to tackle this question. So one thing that kept on happening through the negotiations is, since I'm a historian, but I've taken a ton of political science courses and I really enjoy studying game theory, it was rapidly apparent that there were a bunch of problems that were about to emerge, like a commitment problem, which I'm going to kind of assume you guys are aware of some of these things. The problems of giving unilateral concessions, the basic things that one would read, from game theory about what your opponent is signaling you and what you need to signal back. Sometimes even, so there's kind of just principles of negotiation that it was clear that we weren't following, which in retrospect only strengthens one's respect for those principles and the game theory and the political science literature that kind of tells you how you should be negotiating things. So why weren't those principles followed? Well, for one thing, there was tremendous pressure from the Trump administration, tremendous pressure that we should get out, we should leave. So there was a sense of we need to come to a negotiation here, because before Trump was pressuring, there was no intention to talk to there was no decision to talk to the Taliban without the Afghan government there. There was no decision to talk to the Taliban about a timeline. And in fact, that was starkly resisted by several different elements. But President Trump's pressure caused a lot of those things to change. Now, over time, that's one factor. But another factor is that when you're in negotiations, at least for me, and I know for many of the people there, is you want to be optimistic about things. You want to take a chance at things. I have one close friend, an Afghan professor, who one day he was here in the States because he had a visa enough to get here. And he said, Carter, why don't you guys just take a chance? Make some concessions, give a timeline or talk about a timeline so things can move forward. He says, why do 1,000 Afghans have to die every month because 2,000 Americans died on one day? So that you feel that for the need for peace, you should press forward and try to do something. You should take some chances that are not too risky to take, or it seems like that they're insured. So as negotiations keep going, one of the things is that the Taliban would verbally make a whole lot of commitments. They would say that they repeatedly say in different ways, and different key leaders saying it, we're going to have a political settlement with the government. We're going and we're going to move to this point as soon as the thing is signed. We'll move in that direction. Yes, people from the government will be involved. No, we don't need to have a monopoly. And they'd say in a variety of different ways, and then we'd have some signal sent where they'd actually meet with government officials and such. So that you always knew it wasn't for sure, but there's this possibility here that could happen. They did eventually do some things to reduce violence. They give some confidence. Some people were very taken by the promises that they'll break from Al Qaeda. You can see that today. How many people were taken by that? And that that's a different question in some ways. But so then why would people then? So obviously one says yes, but this is just words. Why would you ever trust words to do that? And the answer at the time was, well, we still have conditions. We still have leverage. So if they don't do the things that they've said they do, we won't withdraw. We'll keep our forces in place. And so they won't get anything. We've lost nothing by saying that we're going to do something. That things can still move, things will still move forward, and we won't lose any ground by doing that. Now and we told that to the Taliban verbally. And you can hear on TV Pompeo and Khalilzad saying it openly. Well, the problem there was we actually didn't have leverage. The leverage was removed very quickly. And the Taliban had a lot more leverage in the end than we did. And we weren't willing to fight for our leverage on things. Our political environment was different than we expected it to be. And so all that leverage just went right out the window. Now, I'd still say, though, that if to do things again, it underlines why in an agreement you want things in writing, not verbally. You want it written down to know what each side is going to say. It reinforces that one shouldn't give a unilateral concession. One should see either what you want first, or some kind of trade back and forth so that both sides are taking steps at the same time so that each side knows that they're getting something out instead of us making most of the commitments ahead of time. It really does underline that. And then in retrospect, it makes one look at the negotiations and think that, well, maybe we just shouldn't have gone down that path at all. Maybe it would have been just the same if we had just left. But I mean, that's kind of makes one think that. I'm not sure if I'm really at that point. Again, when negotiations are going on, it's hard to say that you want to scrub negotiations, scrub peace, and keep on fighting a war.
When you talked about the leverage we have over the Taliban, I don't know if everybody saw the article in the New York Times this morning where on Monday, a State Department official said that the United States was becoming increasingly irritated with the Taliban by its treatment of women and vulnerable individuals who were trying to leave. So we'll see what that translates into. Other questions? Freddie.
I'm curious from both of you, looking forward, what types of scenarios and/or thresholds of violence or threat could trigger a U.S. return to Afghanistan, or if you think we're truly gone for good?
So, I mean, I'll take a stab and turn it over to you. I think to trigger U.S. return to Afghanistan, you'd have to see a very large, you'd have to see hundreds of casualties in the United States at least, if not something that looks like 9/11. And the return, I think, would have first be posed in ways that Professor Hoffman was mentioning, that we may lean at first to overreaction, because we don't want to do what we just did. So had you not do what you just did, you really put the hammer down. And that also depends on administration and such about what happens. Something lesser may generate some kind of precise attack to retaliate and punish the Taliban. The only problem with that is that so the Taliban want the Al Qaeda and those groups, they do want to provoke us, and the more we attack, the more it strengthens those movements. The more we do an attack that does not eliminate them, it just damages some of them, and especially if it kills civilians, the more the people of Afghanistan will support those groups.
Well, you've kind of introduced the nightmare scenario, because I could see, let's say, in the next presidential administration, depending who the president was, terrorists deliberately doing some very provocative act. It doesn't, but that's the problem. It doesn't have to be another 9/11. Something like Madrid 2004 in the United States, or the London 2005 attacks, or even, aspiring more the November 2014 attacks, 2014 or 15. All blends together, unfortunately.
Paris?
Yeah, Paris.
2015 and
2015 attacks, yeah. That would be enough. And you could see, let's say, a president that talks very tough and also has no patience for ground troops using a nuclear weapon. I mean, this is entirely conceivable if a different president were back in office, let's say, to be explicit. But I mean, so that's one nightmare scenario. Given some of the talk I heard, and of course I was working, for a think tank and deeply involved in government after 9/11, no one was talking about nukes. But as I said, when you start saying things like turning a country into a parking lot, even if it's conventional weapons, does it really matter? And they were serious people. But I have to admit, this is like one of the few things that I'm more optimistic than pessimistic about. I don't think we'll ever go back to Afghanistan. And I think, as Carter's very eloquently said, I mean, and to emphasize it, I mean, there aren't many bipartisan issues in the United States. There weren't many things that President Biden agreed with previous President Trump about, but getting out of Afghanistan was one of them. I mean, you could see it in President Biden's March, I'm so bad with dates, but it must have been 2020 article in Foreign Affairs, and then everything that President Trump was saying. So I don't think we'll go back. I suppose more realistically, I mean, my nuclear scenario, I think, is about the worst. But, nowadays, and if you read Robert Kagan's article in the Post on the Washington Post on Sunday, it's easy why one can summon up these dark views. I think the biggest problem is going to be destabilization of South Asia by maybe not Al Qaeda core, but Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, which is its penultimately most recent created terrorist entity. That's different from most other Al Qaeda franchises, which were created before they allied themselves or swore by Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda created that one. And I think over the years, there has been a shift in Al Qaeda's emphasis towards South Asia. And okay, we can say, who cares? South Asia, it's far away. But twice in the early 2000s, in 2001 and 2000, well, I guess 2008 is in the early 2000s, twice in the 2000s, in 2001 and 2008, India and Pakistan nearly came to the brink of nuclear war because of a terrorist attack launched from Pakistan by groups. Lashkar-e-Taiba is not an Al-Qaeda franchise or anything, but it's closely allied with Al-Qaeda. But we see how, and that's part of my problem, is that I don't think you can separate in the 2020s terrorism from great power or from interstate relations. That terrorism, I think, has become embedded in international security and also is a tool for many countries. And we're going to see more of it, not less, because countries see confronting the United States head on militarily, even with navies, takes a long time to build up. But supporting terrorists and doing so clandestinely or surreptitiously can achieve tremendous destabilization and create the kind of chaos that terrorists hope to thrive in or eventually benefit from. Yes,
We
please.
have some questions from the chat. What is your view of the final withdrawal once the decision was made to withdraw? Did the US do a great job getting the 100,000 plus people out, or was it a failure leaving too many people behind?
Well, it's hard not to be impressed with the magnitude of it. 120,000 people is a lot of people. It's hard also not to be impressed by the actions that State Department and our military took there. Going there and seeing them day after day, standing, in barbed wire, picking people up. They know they're in danger. Everyone knows that if you're standing outside of a gate and there's a crowd of people, that there's a huge risk of a suicide bombing. So they're all putting themselves at great danger to rescue as many Americans as possible. And the whole event to me kind of signified a lot of things about the whole Afghanistan war. That there was a sense of idealism about why we were there, the sense that we had a moral obligation in the war, and that wasn't that's not the defined reason as to why we were there, but I think it ran through a lot of people who were there, and now we could see it there, on our TV screens or television or computer screens, by the U.S. servicemen, men and women, trying to help as many Afghans as possible, and then of course all the different private groups and private organizations also trying to help. So you see that at that time. In terms of the withdrawal overall, I don't want to get too much into that, but I think this was a rout. Routes happen in military history. Routes happen in Afghan history. And the things that one sees happen in that are what we saw happen here. There isn't a lot of time to make decisions. Things happen quickly. Forces break down. People run when they shouldn't have ran. And we have to make tough decisions on short timelines. So a lot of this was just in the nature of things. I think as time goes on, there'll be more criticism and discussion of what people did right or what people did wrong. And perhaps some of that is going on right now as we speak in Congress, as General Milley, General McKenzie, and Secretary Austin are speaking.
So the next question is, regarding leaving U.S. troops behind as a viable option, didn't the deal that was cut between the Trump administration and the Taliban precluding attacks against Americans as long as the U.S. left take that option off the table? Also, weren't many territories and cities being lost to the Taliban over the past several years?
So the option of leaving counterterrorism forces in Afghanistan was taken off the table if one wanted to continue with the agreement. That is absolutely true. And the Taliban wouldn't have continued the agreement if we said we were going to keep those forces there. Could we have kept forces? So if we had said that we wanted to stay for longer in the beginning of 2021, there's two things that would have been could have gone from that. One is that we're staying for longer and the deal's off. War is on for however more. The other way things could have gone is that, well, we're staying for longer because we're not satisfied that you've met our conditions. Every negotiation has breakdown. Every negotiation has times when things go and don't go. And we would have said, you haven't met your conditions, so we're not meeting our conditions. And we are going to keep force until you've met our conditions. Now, the Taliban, for that, could have said, oh, we will definitely never meet your conditions. We're going to have war forever. Or they might have said that, okay, we're just going to keep on negotiating this, and we're going to complain, and we'll be upset about it. But negotiations may have continued. I can point to in history to many times when one side has broken things and negotiations continue on, nevertheless. But it is a question there. And what was the other part of that question? I think I missed part of it.
Weren't many territories and cities being lost to the Taliban over the past several years?
So yes, much of the countryside was lost to the Taliban starting in 2015. The times in which we don't provide air support to the Afghan force, they've tended to lost ground. No cities were lost. Cities were lost temporarily before 2021. And some of them, the situation of those cities were bad. Many cities were surrounded. Many provincial capitals were surrounded. But from 2015 on, well, really 2017 onward, U.S. forces and Afghan forces were able to greatly slow what the Taliban was doing, and they weren't making any dramatic strategic gains during that period of time, at least until forces dropped beneath 8,600. At that point, more of that did occur.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. So, oftentimes the inability for the U.S. or the invading country to change the general understanding of that country, or win the war per se, comes from a lack of, I guess what I'm saying, I'm sorry, because of the economic welfare situation in Afghanistan that has persisted, the citizens would not be expected to necessarily challenge the corruption of the government. So knowing that the U.S. aid especially had the records of natural resources that were in Afghanistan, would you consider a U.S. failure to economically develop the country to a point where people could start challenging the system or engaging in democracy? And also, would economic stability prove successful without political engagement with the Taliban? And did the U.S. engage with tribal leaders economically to challenge? Because you mentioned that the tribal leaders were also part of the reason why the U.S. efforts failed. I mean, the Afghan government's efforts failed. So what did the U.S. engage with the tribal leaders economically to change these dynamics?
In terms of large-scale economic development, I'm not sure the United States could have done much more than it did. So we could point to some particular things that maybe they could have focused a little bit more on, say, lithium mining, or improving security around some of the copper mining and such to enable Afghanistan to have a little bit more wealth in those areas and to spur the development. But there were a lot of challenges to that. Partly was the investment necessary to make that happen. Part of it was the rules in the Afghan government that existed to allow investment to happen. So a lot of investors didn't want to invest. There were the security problems that existed. And then most people, when they look at how long it takes for economic development to occur and what makes it right, most will say that, well, 20 years isn't enough time for that to happen. So to enable those people really to enable the people of Afghanistan really to have a more say through economic development, I'm more skeptical that could have worked. What might have helped, and this is again might, is that the Afghan government was established in a very centralized way, where the president has authority over, well, just about everything, appointing ministers, appointing provincial governors, and he himself can appoint like military corps commanders, and that can be done by the Minister of Defense, who's again, of course, appointed by the president. And then even theoretically, even district governors and district police chiefs can be appointed by the president, or the president usually delegates that. The point being that this is all done from Kabul. So if you're a provincial governor or district governor and you're appointed from Kabul, or a police chief, who are you looking to? Who do you feel accountable to? Do you feel accountable to the people, or do you feel accountable to Kabul? And the argument that people like Thomas Barfield or Nobel laureate Roger Myerson makes is that they feel accountable to Kabul. So they're not trying to help the people. They're not worried if what they do upsets the people, because that's not what's going to allow them to keep their job. Giving money to Kabul matters, following Kabul's prerogatives matter. So if the Constitution and the structure of the government had been changed early on, such that district governors and provincial governors and police chiefs, et cetera, were appointed via elections or whatever other means at the local level, then they may have cared more about what the people were going to say, and may have done more to help them rather than allow corruption, et cetera, to occur. Now, many Afghans will also tell me that solution is unrealistic, because no matter what you do, some warlord or someone will take power, and they'll say that solution also wouldn't work. I'm not sure, but I just mentioned it as one of the solutions there. So I think that I'll use that as the answer.
So we've talked a lot about Pakistan as being one of the chief causes, and like that relationship isn't simple, and they have their own internal stability issues. As like one of the chief strategic issues that we didn't solve, is that an issue where you see the United States didn't solve it because we stopped focusing in, or we didn't apply enough leverage, or does Pakistan not have enough internal stability to deal with their own terrorism and the Fada, Baluchistan, etc.
I think the main reason is our interests are so divergent on this issue that they weren't going to come together. Pakistan feels it faces a dire threat from India. That may or may not be true, and it feels that if it doesn't have the support of their own proxy in Afghanistan, that India is going to increase the degree of threat that Pakistan faces through turning Afghanistan into an ally. And they felt that the Afghan government had actually made themselves an ally of India. This perception may or may not be true. And this perception is probably amplified by the fact that Pakistan has military plays an outsized role in its government. And military figures tend to care about military threats, tend to care about conventional military threats. So that may also be shifting things. But nevertheless, it's still the kind of thing that we probably weren't going to get the two of us to come together on. So I think where we could have made some differences is if we use our carrots and sticks a little bit wiser, a little bit earlier. And if we ourselves had been more flexible, we probably could have gotten Pakistan's assistance on like a peace process earlier. And when we had more leverage, maybe bringing the Taliban to the table then. I mean, but it's going to be really hard to look at these things in retrospect now because Pakistan basically succeeded. And so it's going to seem like if I want to say historically that, well, Pakistan would have agreed to a compromise earlier, most people are going to criticize and say, no, that's not true, because they didn't agree to a compromise and they got what they wanted. So we depend on the argument. If for us to believe something more could have been done, we have to believe that earlier on, Pakistan was less optimistic, was more skeptical of its future, and therefore would have made more concessions when our leverage was greater and the Taliban weren't so dominant.
Well, I'll ask a question. How do you assess in terms of the future? What should we read into the appointment of Sirajuddin Haqqani as the Interior Minister?
The Taliban have so far always, gets back to negotiations, they've prioritized their internal politics over satisfying the international community or their international politics. So it means that they are continuing to do that. It means that Haqqani's have a decent amount of influence in the organization, and it should re-underline for us that the Taliban definitely retain ties to terrorists. Not just the Haqqani's terrorists, but the Haqqani's have plenty of connections of their own to terrorist organizations. And it also clarifies that Pakistan does have influence over the Taliban movement because the Haqqanis are known to be close to Pakistan. And right after that, in the midst of the discussions, is when the ISI chief came to Kabul. Mm-hmm. So all of this suggests continued Pakistan influence on that. It's going to make it harder for them to get support by from the international community. Because it undercuts anyone who wants to say the Taliban have moved away from terrorists. It immediately undercuts that argument. It makes any Western president or prime minister vulnerable. If they engage with the Taliban and anything bad happens, they're very politically vulnerable now because you're not only, it's not like you were deceived or fooled. The guy's standing right there. So they've marked their government.
Time for one question. Two.
So on that line, how reflective is or how responsive will the Taliban be to international pressures? Like they have China as a possible state sponsor, and they have Pakistan as a state sponsor. Are they going to become a proxy state to those two countries, or will they be more receptive to the wider Middle East and the West as we move forward?
Well, the Taliban want to be viewed as independent. So even though Pakistan does have influence, they're not going to want to be. They're going to want to be as distant as and independent as they can manage to be. On how much are they going to? Are they going? They will have some. They will do some things to try to get international support and international assistance. They will probably not try to be as blatant and overtly oppressive towards women. They probably not have public executions and stonings of women. We've already seen public executions tonight. So they will probably try to limit that. They will continue to say that they will do things against terrorism, and they will try to limit to some extent terrorists openly being seen there or attacks coming out of it. and we can probably, there's probably some degree of leverage that we have over that, but you've also already identified the weaknesses in our leverage. They will probably get support from other countries. So our leverage is counterbalanced by the leverage that China or Pakistan is presenting to them. Furthermore, with us staying involved in Afghanistan, if we stay involved in Afghanistan through giving the Taliban government money, that will probably cause other states in the region, Iran and Russia, to want to counterbalance us, because nothing brings the region together like us. So we'll have this counter effect where they will give them money, and they may not have the same degree of interest in protecting women's rights or meeting everything that we want. They do have some interest, in countering the terrorist threat. So I'm not sure there's a lot we can do to get the Taliban right now to meet what our concerns are. That doesn't mean we necessarily need to sanction them or treat them like pariahs or not have an embassy. It just means that we should be very sober about how much we think our money is going to buy us with that. If they weren't willing to make concessions when we had 10,000 plus troops in the country and we still had money flowing in and the government wasn't defeated, it's not really clear why they're going to make concessions now.
Well, they're willing to make deals with China regardless of the persecution of the Uyghur people there. Probably acquire Chinese surveillance technology for the Interior Ministry in Kabul to use against their own people. But maybe I'm descending down my well of cynicism.
China's not asking them to do much in return.
No, and of course Pakistan's already made that choice too.
Right, no, Pakistan's absolutely made that choice.
Any last question online? Okay, well, we're just at 1 o'clock. It's no surprise that we're able to fill an hour and a half. Carter, it's been remarkable.
No,
I mean,
thanks.
there's no one better to discuss this, and we're really in your debt making time when we know how busy you are. So please join me in thanking Carter, Dr. Carter Malkasian.